The other day I was watching this YouTube video, and it was a debate. And the participants were Stephen Fry, Christopher Hitchens, Archbishop John, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Anyakin, and Ed Whitcomb, who is a British member of Parliament. And this is put on by the London Intelligence Squared organization. And the question, or the statement, I guess, they were debating was, the Catholic Church is a force for good in the world. And this took place back in 2009. Now, to me, Fry and Hitchens, I call them professional atheists. They look at believers as ignorant, irrational, and or just misinformed. And their main argument is that religion should not be used as the basis for moral decision making. Those who hold these views, they tend not to give alternatives to religious beliefs for deciding right from wrong. They may come up with abstract ideas such as natural law, but they really don't offer any practical application for their ideas. So what I want to talk about in this podcast is what may be the result from replacing objective religious laws with subjective moral codes. Basically, what is the opportunity cost of atheism? And I will start with one of my favorite sayings that economists like to put out there. There is no such thing as a free lunch. And it goes something like this. Assume you were invited out for lunch and someone else was paying. Would this be a free lunch for you? Well, sometimes people will say, well, somebody had to pay for it, so it wasn't free. But that's kind of missing the point. The question is if it was a free lunch for you. And where the economist comes in is they would ask, well, what would you have been doing if you were not eating lunch? There are many answers you could give to this question, but the main idea here is that you had to give up some activity that you could have been doing rather than enjoying your lunch. And this is what in economics is called opportunity cost. And if you want the official definition, opportunity cost is the value of your next best foregone opportunity. Basically, it's the cost, and it's not in dollar terms, but in the subjective value you place in alternative actions you could have taken. So if you would have spent time playing video games if you're not having lunch with your friend, the cost of the lunch would be the value you put on playing video games. Hence, it was a real cost, therefore it was not a free lunch for you. This is actually one of the first topics you'll ever hear about in any economics course. You start with defining opportunity costs, then introduce the production possibilities model, go on to comparative advantage, leading up to trade theory. And then pretty much after that, you won't hear about opportunity costs again in the course. However, to me, this is an idea too important to be ignored, especially in the area of policy analysis. There's another expression that I'm particularly fond of, that being never tear down a fence before you know why the fence was put up in the first place. For example, current policy A is in place and people are deciding on whether they want to replace it with policy B. One main thing to think about is why policy A was enacted in the first place before deciding if it should be replaced by policy B. In other words, what's the opportunity cost of policy B? That's the value of policy A. What I want to put out here is my thoughts on the opportunity cost of atheism. Simply put, the opportunity cost of atheism is giving up the belief that there is a God. But we need to go into a little more depth about believing in a God and the value that such belief has for a person. And I'm going to restrict myself to just one benefit that a person gets from believing in a God. In virtually all religions, One attribute of God is that he is a lawgiver, allowing the believer to know what can be considered a moral action and those actions which should not be undertaken. So, for the atheists, they give up God as the arbitrator of right and wrong, and therefore then they must search for another source as a guide to moral behavior. And I have heard all the arguments concerning the negative effects that religious belief have on a society. The Catholic Church did this, the Protestants did that. And I could do an entire podcast addressing these issues. And, if the listeners would be interested in hearing those thoughts, let me know, and I'll see what I can put together. What I think is missing in the discourse is an investigation into the effects of using an alternative to God in moral decision making. And to address this, I want to do it in 4 parts, sharing the thoughts of 4 authors who can give us some insights into this question. Part 1, God is dead. If you ask anyone if they know anything about the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, it is most likely that they will say, wasn't he the one who said God is dead? Yes, he was. And you probably know another phrase that he gave us, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. But I'm just going with the God is dead. Nietzsche first used the phrase God is dead in his book, The Gay Signs, which was published in 1882. And I'm just going to give you the quote from it. God is dead. God remains dead. We have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all, that the world has yet owned, has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? And how did we kill God? Well, started in the late 17th century, which was the dawn of the Age of Enlightenment. And what was the Age of Enlightenment? Chiefly valuing knowledge gained through rationalization and empiricism. The Enlightenment was concerned with a wide range of social and political ideas, such as natural law, liberty and progress, toleration and fraternity, constitutional government, and the formal separation of church and state. Along with the scientific revolution, which was a series of events that marked the emergence of modern science during the early modern period, when developments in mathematics, physics, astronomy, biology, including the human anatomy, and chemistry, transformed the views of society about nature. How was the universe created? What caused the planets to stay in their orbits? What causes there to be life on Earth? Causal determinism proposes that there is an unbroken chain of prior occurrences stretching back to the origin of the universe, and there is nothing in the universe that has no cause or is self-caused. Humans have always searched to understand this cause and effect process. For most of history, how the universe was created, why the planets move as they do, and why life exists was attributed to the action of gods. However, with the scientific revolution, other causes were postulated. The universe was created by the Big Bang. The planets were under the influence of gravity, and life evolved from the primordial soup. An unknowable God was no longer needed to explain the world. Facts replaced faith. When man killed God the lawmaker, he also killed God the righteous judge. God was the source of absolute truths concerning right versus wrong behavior. There were repercussions associated with this. Follow the law of God, and you will have eternal happiness in the afterlife. Ignore his laws, and this earned you eternal damnation. The main assumption in the economic theory of the self-interested consumer is that individuals seek to maximize their satisfaction subject to constraints. They consider both the costs and the benefits of any actions they undertake. For example, assume someone is thinking about embezzling from their employer. They will look at the value of the money they are intending to pilfer, as well as the probability of the owner discovering the theft and consequences of being discovered. For some individual, the benefits will outweigh the cost and the theft will take place. However, if this individual believes there is a God who has deemed theft to be a sin and will punish sinners, this cost will be included in the calculus of the person, and they are less likely to commit the crime. In his 1883 book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche understood that God is dead means that the idea of God can no longer provide values. Secular knowledge would result in nihilism, which would be a cultural trend in which people lose the values and ideas guiding their lives. Nietzsche introduces the idea of the last man. For this individual, God has represented that idea that man should seek autonomy and act in the service of one's self-interest, making this a sin. Animalistic impulses such as sexual lust, pride, and the desire for power were banned as evil elements to be tamed and eradicated. The individual was taught by God not to overcome himself, but to deny himself and to weaken his body for the sake of his soul. With the death of God, the last man will create new meaning on earth, one that embraces the individual's desires to actualize themselves. The last man, however, will eventually become a nihilist who asserts that his life is inherently meaningless and lacks a higher purpose. Moral values are baseless and knowledge is impossible. These individuals are characterized by their lack of ambition, their aversion to risk, and their complacency. The last man lacks purpose and depth because he is lacking in the will to power, which Nietzsche considers to be the most motivating force behind all life and human interactions. The last man has a sole desire for his own comfort and is incapable of creating anything beyond oneself in any form. For Nietzsche, all is not lost. He introduces the concept of Übermensch, roughly translated as overman. Nietzsche intended his Übermensch to be the ultimate goal of mankind, the casting off of society's Christian ideals and moving towards the final form of human evolution. He felt humans were incomplete beings that relied too much on antiquated notions of religion as a means of fulfillment. This overman can be summarized as someone who rejects traditional morality, particularly the slave morality of Christianity, which emphasizes self-denial and weakness. They are masters of their own will, creating their own values and meaning rather than accepting prepackaged morality. They are constantly striving to improve and create. The Übermensch embraces life, including its challenges and suffering, as part of a joyful and creative existence. He is an ideal for humanity to strive for, not a specific individual who has already achieved it. Whereas Nietzsche diagnosed the Christian value system as a reaction against life, and hence destructive in a sense, the new values that the Übermensch will be responsible for will be life-affirming and creative. Through realizing this new set of values, the Übermensch is perfect because they have mastered all human obstacles. The overman is the master of the earth, fulfilling the mission of the earth and giving meaning to history. In other words, he is a lawgiver, a law interpreter, the one who directs the affairs of the earth, a man-god. Part 2. Can an axe murder be a moral good? Atheism has taken hold. God is dead. And society has evolved to having mostly nihilistic last men with a scattering of overmen, the masters of the earth. However, these overmen will need some criteria for deciding good versus evil. Before moving on to the second part and the second author, I'd like to present a thought experiment. Assume you could travel back and visit a small town in Austria-Hungary. You ask around for the locations of Flickengruber residence, and once obtaining the information, you make your way to the residence. You sneak in and find an infant boy sleeping in a crib. You decide to murder the child. What is your action moral? Does your answer change if you know that little boy, Adolf Hitler, was responsible for at least 48 million deaths? For someone who sees God as the lawgiver and righteous judge, that answer is easy. All religions prohibit murder. So the answer would be no. But take God out of the equation, and it is quite possible to go with the other answer. With the publication in 1866 of Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, we get some insights on how the overman will choose to kill the baby in this scenario. Here's how the story goes. Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov, and I'm probably going to mess up that last name, a former law student who lives in extreme poverty in a tiny rented room in St. Petersburg. Isolated and antisocial, he has abandoned all attempts to support himself, basically becoming an example of Nietzsche's last man. He is brooding obsessively on a scheme he has decided to murder and rob an elderly pawnbroker, Alona Ivanova. On the pretext of pawning a watch, he visits her apartment, but he remains unable to commit himself. Later, in a state of extreme nervous tension, Raskolnikov steals an axe and makes his way once more to the old woman's apartment. He gains access by pretending he has something to pawn, and then attacks her with an axe, killing her. He also kills her half-sister, Lizaveta, who happens to stumble upon the scene of the crime. Shaken by his actions, he steals only a handful of items and a small purse, leaving much of the pawnbroker's wealth untouched. Due to sheer good fortune, he manages to escape the building and return to his room undetected. What was the cause of the second visit? After the visit to the pawnbroker, Raskolnikov went to a tavern. I will let Dostoevsky explain what happened in that tavern. Almost beside Raskolnikov, at the next table, there was sitting a student whom he did not know and had never seen, and with him a young officer. All at once he heard the student mention to the officer the pawnbroker, Alana Ivanova, and gave him her address. This of itself seemed strange to Raskolnikov. He had just come from her, and here at once he heard her name. Of course it was a chance, but he could not shake off a very extraordinary impression, and here someone seemed to be speaking expressly for him. The student began telling his friend various details about Alona Ivanova. She is first rate, he said. You can always get money from her. She is as rich as a Jew. She can give you 5,000 rubles at a time, and she is not above taking a pledge for a ruble. Lots of our fellows have had dealings with her, but she is an awful old harpy. And he began describing how spiteful and uncertain she was, how if you were only a day late with your interest, the pledge was lost, how she gave a quarter of the value of an article and took 5 and even 7% a month on it, and so on. The student chattered on, saying that she had a sister, Lizaveta, whom the wretched little creature was continually beating and kept in constant bondage like a small child, though Lizaveta was at least 6 feet high. They began talking about Lizaveta. The student spoke about her with a particular relish and was continually laughing, and the officer listened with great interest and asked him to send Lizaveta to do some mending for him. Raskolnikov did not miss a word and learned everything about her. Lizaveta was younger than the old woman and was her half-sister, being the child of a different mother. She was 35. She worked day and night for her sister, And besides doing the cooking and the washing, she did sewing and worked as a charwoman and gave her sister all she earned. She did not dare to accept an order or job of any kind without her sister's permission. The old woman had already made her will, and Lizaveta knew of it. And by this will she would get not a farthing, nothing but the movables, chairs, and so on. All the money was left to a monastery, that prayers might be said for her in perpetuity. Lizaveta was of lower rank than her sister, unmarried, and awfully uncouth in appearance, remarkably tall with long feet that looked as they were bent outwards. She always wore battered goatskin shoes and was clean in her person. What the student expressed most surprise and amusement about was the fact that Lizaveta was continually with child. "But you say she was hideous," observed the officer. "Yes, she is so dark-skinned and looks like a soldier dressed up. But you know she's not at all hideous. She has such a good-natured face and eyes, striking so. And the proof of it is lots of people are attracted by her. She is such a soft, gentle creature, ready to put up with anything, always willing to do anything. And her smile is really very sweet." "You seem to find her attractive yourself," laughed the officer. "From her queerness, no. I tell you what, I could kill that damn old woman and make off with her money, I assure you, without the faintest conscience prick." The student added with warmth. The officer laughed again, while Raskolnikov shuddered. How strange it was! "Listen, I want to ask you a serious question," the student said hotly. "I was joking, of course, but look here. On one side we have a stupid, senseless, worthless, spiteful, alien, horrid old woman, not simply useless, but doing actual mischief, who has not an idea of what she is living for herself, and will die in a day or two in any case. You understand? You understand?" "Yes, yes, I understand," answered the officer, watching his excited companion attentively. "Well, listen then. On the other side, fresh young lives thrown away for want of help, and by thousands on every side. 100,000 good deeds could be done and helped on that old woman's money, which will be buried in a monastery. Hundreds, thousands perhaps, might be set on the right path. Dozens of families saved from destitution, from ruin, from vice, from the lock hospitals, and all with her money. Kill her, take her money, and with the help of it devote oneself to the service of humanity and the good of all. What do you think? Would not one tiny crime be wiped out by thousands of good deeds? For one life, thousands would be saved from corruption and decay. One death and 100 live in exchange. It's simple arithmetic. Besides, what value has the life of that sickly, stupid, ill-natured old woman in the balance of existence? No more than the life of a louse, of a black beetle. Less, in fact, because the old woman is doing harm. She is wearing out the lives of others. The other day she bit Lizetta's finger out of spite. It almost had to be amputated. "Of course she does not deserve to live," remarked the officer, "but there it is, it's nature." "Oh well, brother, but we have to correct and direct nature. And, but for that, we should drown in an ocean of prejudice. But for that, there would never have been a single great man. They talk of duty, conscience. I don't want to say anything against duty and conscience, but the point is, what do we mean by them? Stay, I have another question to ask you. Listen." "No, you stay. I'll ask you a question. Listen, well, you are talking and speechifying away, but tell me, would you kill the old woman yourself?" "Of course not. I was only arguing the justice of it. It has nothing to do with me." "But I think if you would not do it yourself, there's no justice about it. Let's have another game." Raskolnikov was violently agitated. Of course, it was all ordinary youthful talk and thought, such as he had often heard before in different forms and on different themes. But why had he happened to hear such a discussion and such ideas at the very moment when his own brain was just conceiving the very same ideas? And why, just at the moment when he brought away the embryo of his ideas from the old woman and dropped at once upon a conversation about her. The coincidence always seemed strange to him. This trivial talk in the tavern had an immense influence on him in his later action, as though there had really been in it something preordained, some guiding hint. The student and the officer were applying the concept of utilitarianism in their discussion. Jeremy Bentham is considered the founder of the philosophy of utilitarianism. In an introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, published in 1780, Bentham defined as the fundamental axiom of his philosophy the principle that it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. In welfare economics, a major topic is Pareto efficiency, named for the Italian civil engineer and economist Winfredo Pareto. A change in policy is called Pareto superior if it leaves at least one person in society better off without leaving anyone else worse off than they were before. A situation is called Pareto efficient or Pareto optimal if all possible Pareto improvements have already been made. In other words, there are no longer any ways left to make one person better off without making some other person worse off. It can be argued that in most societies they are Pareto efficient. There are few, if any, Pareto superior moves that can be made. Obviously, the situation discussed by the student and the officer and then enacted by Raskolnikov would not be considered to be a Pareto superior move because Alona Ivanova was definitely made worse off. However, utilitarianism does not require Pareto efficiency. The best actions are those that maximize the good of the society and not that of each individual in the society. There is a major problem when using utilitarianism as a basis for morality. In Dostoevsky's story, Alona Ivanova was made worse off, and theoretically her death and the theft and redistribution of her property would make thousands better off. As long as the benefit to the thousands outweigh the cost to the individual, the action would be morally justifiable. The problem is with the objective measurement of these benefits and costs. Economists love to use the concept of utils as a measure of satisfaction, even though utils do not exist, and even if they did, interpersonal comparisons of utility or happiness is impossible. Since objective measurements are impossible, subjective measurements of the benefits and the costs must be made. This will be the job of the overmen. Crime and Punishment is mostly the story of Raskolnikov's internal struggle, the torments of his own conscience, rather than the legal consequences of committing the crime. He commits murder with the idea that he possesses enough intellectual and emotional fortitude to deal with the ramifications. He is an overman, but his sense of guilt soon overwhelms him to the point of psychological and somatic illness. In the epilogue, he realizes his formal punishment, having decided to confess and end his alienation from society. It is interesting to think about Raskolnikov's official punishment. Due to the fullness of his confession at the time when another man had already confessed to the killings, and his state of mind at the time of the murders, Raskolnikov was sentenced to only 8 years of penal servitude. Would the overman think it is morally justifiable to travel back in time and murder Hitler when he was an infant? One evil person killed, 48 million lives saved. The answer would be yes. An answer 100% contradicting the teachings of God. Just an aside here. Even if the overmen went back and killed the infant Hitler, the circumstances in Germany at that time, which allowed for someone like Hitler to rise to power, were still present. Who would have taken his place? Perhaps a more evil dictator would have come to power, and even more people would have lost their lives under that regime. And then does the Overmen travel again back in time and kill that individual? Will the cycle ever end? Part 3, a case study, the U.S.S.R. From the conversion of Prince Vladimir the Great in 987 until the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the concept of separation of church and state was alien to the Russian mindset. The Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Tsar worked together for the betterment of the people. The most notable example of this was in 1619. Fyodor Romanov was canonically enthroned as Filaret, Patriarch of Moscow and of all Russia, while his son, Michael, was Tsar. From 1619 to 1633, there were two actual sovereigns, Tsar Michael and his father, the Most Holy Patriarch Filaret. Theoretically, they were co-regents, but Filaret frequently transacted affairs of state without consulting the Tsar. He replenished the treasury by a more equitable and rational system of assessing and collecting the taxes. Another great service rendered by Filaret to his country was the reorganization of the Moscow army with the help of foreign officers. Exercising the rights of a sovereign, Filaret issued a royal decree in May 1625, which gave the Patriarch the right to judge and oversee the clerical and peasant populations of the Patriarchate in all matters except for theft and robbery. At the same time, Tsar Michael's reign saw some of the greatest territorial expansion in Russian history. During his reign, the conquest of Siberia continued, largely accomplished by the Cossacks and financed by the Stroganov merchant family. The end of this relationship between church and state can be traced to the publication of Capital, a critique of political economy by Karl Marx. He put it out between 1867 and 1884. It was in a couple parts. Russian was the first language into which Das Kapital was translated from the original. The populists in Russia and in exile eagerly responded to the theories of Marx. Right from the beginning, when it was making no impression on the Western European public, Marx's opus exercised an enormous influence upon the Russian intelligentsia. 900 copies of Das Kapital were sold out in St. Petersburg within a few weeks after its publication in 1872, a very large number considering the character of the book, the time, and the place. But even before that, Marx received striking proof of strange Russian enthusiasm for his ideas when on 12 March 1870, a group of Russian revolutionaries asked him to represent Russia on the Great Council of the First International. It was the members of the Russian intelligentsia that became the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution. These leaders rejected the idea that religion should be the course of absolute truths and the basis of moral decisions. This notion is quite clear in the writings of Marx. He wrote, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of a soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people." Vladimir Lenin, speaking of religion in 1905, alluded to Marx's comments. "Those who toil and live in want all their lives are taught by religion to be submissive and patient while here on earth, and to take comfort in the hope of a heavenly reward. But those who live by the labor of others are taught by religion to practice charity while on earth, thus offering them a cheap way of justifying their entire existence as exploiters and selling them at a moderate price tickets to well-being in heaven. Religion is opium for the people. Religion is a sort of spiritual booze in which the slaves of capital drown their human image, their demand for a life more or less worthy of men." It's easy to see how this is simply a restatement of the philosophy of Nietzsche. The Bolsheviks were atheists, but atheists are not necessarily enemies of religion. Many atheists take the position of live and let live. However, this was not the approach of the Bolsheviks. This can be shown by one of my favorite truisms in economics, that of revealed preference. Stated simply, it says that you never understand a person by what they say. You watch what they actually do to get insight about their true preferences. The Soviet Union was the first state to have elimination of religion as an ideological objective espoused by the country's ruling political party. Towards that end, the communist regime confiscated church property, ridiculed religion, harassed believers, and propagated materialism and atheism in schools. The clergy generally were perceived by the Soviet authorities as counter-revolutionary force and thus subject to suppression and eventual liquidation. In early February 1918, the Bolshevik-controlled government of Soviet Russia enacted a decree on separation of church and state and school from church. Although it gave freedom to profess any religion or profess none, it deprived religious organizations of the right to own any property and legal status. Legal religious activities in the territories controlled by the Bolsheviks was effectively reduced to services and sermons inside church buildings. The decree, an attempt by Bolshevik officials to requisition school property, caused sharp resentment on the part of the Russian Orthodox clergy and provoked violent clashes on some occasions. For example, on February 1st, 1918, there was a bloody confrontation in Petrograd's Alexander Nevsky Lavra between the Bolsheviks trying to take control of the monastery's premises and the believers. In the first 5 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, 28 bishops and 1,200 priests were executed. Between 1917 and 1935, 130,000 Eastern Orthodox priests were arrested. Of these, 95,000 were put to death. Orthodox clergy and active believers were habitually subjected to formal prosecutions on political charges, arrests, exiles, imprisonment in camps, and later could also be incarcerated in mental hospitals. A new and widespread persecution of the church was subsequently instituted under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev. The second round of repressions, harassments, and church closures took place between 1959 and 1964, when Nikita Khrushchev was in office. The number of Orthodox churches fell from around 22,000 in 1959 to around 8,000 in 1965. Priests, monks, and faithful were killed or imprisoned, and the number of functioning monasteries was reduced to less than 20. Subsequent to Khrushchev's ousting, the church and government remained on unfriendly terms until 1988. However, among the general population, large numbers remained religious. It should be obvious that the leaders of the Soviet Union saw the church as a competitor in deciding moral issues. In the U.S.S.R., the ideas discussed in the conversation between the soldier and the student in Crime and Punishment was instituted on a national scale. The fundamental ideals expressed by Karl Marx became the measuring rod for deciding moral actions. The capital-owning class, the pawnbroker, obtained their wealth off the labor of others, her sister and her customers. For the betterment of society, the capital class needs to be destroyed and their wealth distributed to the needy. Theft can be justified. Now imagine an entire society that which rejected religion as the basis of absolute truth being replaced by enlightened individuals. Fortunately, we do not have to imagine what life would be like in that society. All we have to do is look at the works of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was a Soviet and Russian author and dissident who helped to raise global awareness of political repression in the Soviet Union, especially the Gulag prison system. He was awarded the 1970 Nobel Prize in Literature for the ethical force with which he has pursued the indispensable traditions of Russian literature. He spent 8 years in the Gulag and then internal exile for calling for the overthrow of the Soviet regime in private correspondence. Two of his works, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, published in 1962, and The Gulag Archipelago, published in 1973, give detailed insights into life living under the control of the overmen. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is a stark portrayal of life in a Soviet labor camp during the Stalinist regime. The novel follows a single day in the life of Ivan Denisovich Shukov, a prisoner enduring the brutal conditions of the Gulag. The story begins at dawn as Shukov wakes up in his barracks, a grim, overcrowded space. Throughout the day, he faces hardships such as hunger, extreme cold, hard labor, and the ever-present threat of punishment. Despite the oppressive environment, Shukov maintains his humanity and resilience. His goal for the day is to survive it with dignity, finding small amounts of solace, whether it's savoring a piece of bread or taking pride in his work. Shukov's day unfolds with various interactions, showing the cruelty of the system and the dehumanization of prisoners, but also the ways they manage to retain a sense of self-worth. He interacts with the other prisoners, each one trying to navigate the system in their way, whether through survival tactics, small acts of rebellion, or resignation. Shukov is a man who, though beaten down, still holds on to his inner strength and personal integrity. The novel reveals the horrors of the Soviet labor camps, but it also reflects on human endurance, solidarity, and the importance of inner freedom, even when all eternal freedoms are stripped away. In the end, while the oppressive system continues, Shukov's personal victory is the quiet internal triumph of surviving another day with dignity intact. A more detailed look at the society can be seen in the Gulag Archipelago that explores the brutal labor camp system known as the Gulag through his personal testimonies of prisoners, the accounts of guards, and Solzhenitsyn's own experiences. The book is a mixture of memoir, historical analysis, and philosophical reflection, and is divided into three main sections. First one being arrest. Solzhenitsyn begins by describing the arbitrary nature of arrest in the Soviet Union. People were often taken from their homes without warning or evidence, accused of vague political crimes like anti-Soviet agitation or counter-revolutionary activity. Torture, false confessions, and the lack of legal due process were widespread. Solzhenitsyn details how ordinary citizens could be swept up into the system based on nothing more than suspicion or the desire to meet state quotas. The second section details the brutal conditions of interrogations, where prisoners were subjected to physical and psychological torture to force confessions. This part explores the horrors of the Soviet legal system, where trials were typically a formality and verdicts were decided before the trial even began. Many of those who were imprisoned for political reasons had no idea why they were arrested or what they were accused of and were left in a state of confusion and fear. The third section deals with the life within the Soviet labor camps, where prisoners faced inhumane conditions, overcrowding, forced labor, extreme cold, inadequate food, and the constant threat of violence. Solzhenitsyn emphasizes how the system dehumanized not only the prisoners but also the guards, creating a society where survival often meant betraying one's own morals. In the camps, the ideas of justice became perverted, and survival was a daily battle of endurance, compromise, and moral decay. Throughout the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn draws on his own experiences as a prisoner, as well as the account of fellow inmates, to expose the extensive nature of the Gulag system and its effect on the individual and society at large. He provides not only a historical account, but also a philosophical analysis of totalitarianism, the corrupting influence of unchecked power, and the importance of human dignity. What was the end result of this desire to use the reasoning of men rather than absolute truth postulated by religious beliefs for the determination of moral actions. Before the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the archival revelations, some historians estimated that the numbers killed just during Stalin's regime were 20 million or higher. After the Soviet Union dissolved, evidence from the Soviet archives were declassified and researchers were allowed to study it. This contained official records of 799,455 executions, around 1.5 to 1.7 million deaths in the gulags, some 390,000 deaths during the decolonization, which is where farmers who owned a couple acres were forced off their land and relocated, that forced settlement, and up to 400,000 deaths of persons deported during the 1940s, with a total of about 3.3 million officially recorded victims in these categories. The deaths of at least 5.5 to 6.5 million persons in the Soviet famine of 1932 through 33 are sometimes included with the victims of the Stalin era. Part 4. Implications for the United States. Between 1941 and 1945, 11 million were murdered during the Nazi regime, the Holocaust. It is estimated that 61 million people were eliminated in the Soviet Union. During Mao Zedong's leadership in China of 1949 to 1976, the number of unnatural deaths is estimated to be somewhere between 44 and 72 million. During the Cambodian genocide, the systematic persecution and killing of Cambodian citizens by the Khmer Rouge under the leadership of Pol Pot resulted in deaths of 1.5 to 2 million people from 1975 to 1979. This was nearly 25% of the Cambodia's populations. All of these governments rejected religious beliefs, holding to the utilitarian notion that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Hitler, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot could be modeled as overmen, as described by Nietzsche. They saw themselves as enlightened men who did not need a God as a lawgiver, replaced by science and rational thought. But some would say this could never happen in the United States. However, an argument can be made that under certain circumstances, any country could devolve into totalitarian regimes led by an atheistic overman. The founding of the United States is deeply intertwined with the faith and principles of its early leaders. While the founding fathers came from diverse religious backgrounds, many were guided by a profound belief in God and sought to establish a nation grounded in liberty, justice, and moral integrity. Their faith influenced the shaping of the nation's constitution, laws, and ethical framework, reflecting a reliance on divine guidance and providence. The Founding Fathers believed that faith and freedom were intrinsically linked. They recognized that true liberty is rooted in moral responsibility and the acknowledgement of a higher authority. This belief is evident in the Declaration of Independence, where they affirm that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. By grounding the concept of human rights in divine origin, they underscored the importance of faith in ensuring justice and equality. Many of the Founding Fathers were men of prayer who sought God's guidance for their decisions. For instance, Benjamin Franklin, during the Constitutional Convention, famously called for daily prayers, recognizing the need for divine assistance in their deliberations. This reliance on God's providence reflects a humility and acknowledgement that human wisdom alone was insufficient to build a just and enduring nation. The moral and ethical teachings of Christianity significantly influenced the Founding Fathers, They understood that a nation's strength lies not just in its institutions, but the character of its people. John Adams, the second president of the United States, stated, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." This highlights the belief that personal virtue and public morality are essential for a nation's welfare and stability. The First Amendment of the United States Constitution has two provisions concerning religion: the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause prohibits the government from establishing a religion. The precise definition of establishment is unclear. Historically, it meant prohibiting state-sponsored churches, such as the Church of England. However, today, freedom of religion is seen more as freedom from religion, and separation of church and state means that religious tenets cannot be the basis of laws. On September 12, 1960, presidential candidate John F. Kennedy gave a major speech in Houston to a group of Protestant ministers on the issue of religion. "I believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish, where no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any other ecclesiastical source, where no religious body seeks to impose its will directly or indirectly upon the general populace or the public acts of its officials, and where religious liberty is so indivisible that an act against one church is treated as an act against all." A recent example of this idea being put into action is former President Biden. Although a lifetime member of the Roman Catholic Church, was a fierce advocate for legalized abortion. Despite the profound Judeo-Christian influence on American society, atheism has gained visibility in the United States since the 1960s. In the 21st century, atheism began to achieve unprecedented exposure in the American society, in large part because of the emergence of several high-profile atheists who generated considerable media coverage. These celebrity atheists range from journalists to comedians to scientists, and included Vanity Fair, The Atlantic writer Christopher Hitchens, evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, comedian Bill Maher, comedian Ricky Gervais, physicist Lawrence Krauss, and philosopher of neuroscience Sam Harris. Unlike previous generations of atheists who tended to remain anonymous and did not publicly acknowledge their views, these high-profile atheists openly critiqued religion and aggressively asserted their atheistic beliefs. Harris, Dawkins, and Hitchens each wrote books which were best-selling, defending atheism and criticizing religion in The End of Faith in 2004, The God Delusion in 2006, and God Is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything in 2007, respectively. 2023 poll by the Pew Research Center found that 4% of Americans in the United States self-identified as atheists. This is an increase from 3.1% of Americans in 2014. However, in 2014, 9% of Americans agreed with the statement, "do not believe in God," while 2% agreed with the statement, "do not know if they believe in God." According to a poll by the nonprofit PRRI in 2023, 4% of Americans were atheists and 5% were agnostic. Polling by Gallup in 2022 showed that 17% of respondents replied no when asked, "Do you believe in God?" in a binary fashion, but when worded differently in 2023, Gallup found that 12% of respondents replied they do not believe in God, and 14% replied they were not sure about the existence of God. Other people, and this is where it gets to me a little scary. Of people born between 1990 and 1994, 34% are atheists. For baby boomers, it's around 15%, and for older Americans, about 6%. No one can tell what changes in the society dynamics will occur in 75 years, but if we extrapolate current trends, I could see atheists becoming 50% of the United States population. Along with an increase in the number of Americans who identify as atheists, there's also been an increase in the number of Americans who express positive opinions about socialism. In 2022, the Pew Research Center found that 36% of American adults say they view socialism somewhat, 30%, or very, 6%, positively, while the majority of the public, 57%, continues to view capitalism favorably. That is 8 percentage points lower than in 2019. In 2019, nearly two-thirds of Democrats and Democratic leaners, 65%, had a positive view of socialism. As was in the case of atheism being more prevalent among the young, the same is true with regard to socialism. Just 40% of those ages 18 to 29 view capitalism positively. Adults younger than 50 are also more likely than those 50 and older to have positive impressions of socialism. The Road to Serfdom is a book published in 1944 by the Austrian-British economist and philosopher Friedrich Hayek. In the book, Hayek warns of the danger of tyranny that inevitably results from government control of economic decision-making through central planning. He further argues that the abandonment of individualism and classical liberalism inevitably leads to a loss of freedom, the creation of an oppressive society, the tyranny of a dictator, and the serfdom of the individual. Hayek argues that Western democracies, including the United Kingdom and the United States, have progressively abandoned that freedom in economic affairs without which personal and political freedom has never existed in the past. Society has mistakenly tried to ensure continuing prosperity by centralized planning, which inevitably leads to totalitarianism. We have in effect undertaken to dispense with the forces which produce unseen results and to replace the impersonal and anonymous mechanisms in the market by collective and conscious direction of all social forces to deliberately chosen goals. Socialism, while presented as a means of assuring equality, does so through restraint and servitude, while democracy seeks equality and liberty. Planning, because it is coercive, is an inferior method of regulation, while the competition of a free market is superior because it is the only method by which our activities can be adjusted to each other without the coercive or arbitrary intervention of authority. Centralized planning is inherently undemocratic in Hayek's view because it requires that the will of a small minority be imposed upon the people. The power of these minorities to act by taking money or property in pursuit of centralized goals destroys the role of law and individual freedoms. Where there is centralized planning, the individual would more than ever become a mere means to be used by the authority in the service of such abstractions as the social welfare or the good of the community. Even the very poor have more personal freedom in an open society than a centrally planned one, while the last resort of a competitive economy is the bailiff. The ultimate sanction of a planned economy is the hangman. Socialism is a hypocritical system because its professed humanitarian goals can only be put into practice by brutal methods, of which most socialists disapprove. Such centralized systems also require effective propaganda so that the people come to believe that the state's goals are theirs. Hayek argues that the root of National Socialism, Nazism, lies in socialism, and then draws parallels to the thought of British leaders. The percentage of the population in the United States that identify that atheists and express positive views of socialism is increasing. With socialism, there will arise overmen who will make decisions based upon utilitarian principles rather than absolute truths. Therefore, the fundamental conditions that gave rise to Nazism and communism are present in the United States. Does this necessarily mean that we can expect outcomes that we witnessed in Germany, the Soviet Union, China, and Cambodia? It could be argued that the culture in the United States will not allow this to happen. It is comfortable to say that the Germans, Russians, Chinese have different cultures and histories that allowed for these totalitarian systems to come to power. One story I always told in my college classes was about the myth of fingerprints. I would ask the students if all fingerprints are unique. Of course, they would answer what they were taught, that they are all different. Then I would tell them that they're all incorrect, that they're all the same. And then I'd say, look around the room. Notice all the different genders, ages, races, etc. in the class. And you are all unique, correct? And they would agree. Then I would ask them a set of questions. Is it wrong to murder? Is it wrong to steal? Should we help the disadvantaged? Things along that line. Turns out they were all against murder and theft and think that the disadvantaged should be given some assistance. Yes, on a micro level, fingerprints and individuals are different. But on the macro level, fingerprints defined as just being marks left on the surface by the oil in people's hands, and thus the same is the same with people. I really believe that most people are the same rather than totally unique. And this would lead me to reject the idea that culture plays a role in determining if a totalitarian system is formed. Another thing to consider is how the overmen can convince the individual to accept policies that they might find to be morally reprehensible. An interesting psychology experiment provides some insights into this question. In the early 1960s, a series of social psychology experiments were conducted by Yale University psychologist Stanley Milgram, who intended to measure the willingness of study participants to obey an authority figure who instructed them to perform acts conflicting with their personal conscience. Participants were led to believe that they were assisting a fictitious experiment in which they had to administer electric shocks to a learner. These fake electric shocks gradually increased to levels that would have been fatal if they had been real. The experiments unexpectedly found that a very high proportion of subjects would fully obey the instructions, with each participant going up to 300 volts and 65% going up to the full 450 volts. Milgram divides his psychological study to explain the psychology of genocide. This tendency of people to comply could result in what's called useful idiots. A useful idiot or useful fool is a disapproving description of a person, suggesting that the person thinks they are fighting for a cause without fully comprehending the consequences of their actions, and who does not realize they are being manipulated by the cause's leaders or by other political players. In his 1947 book, Planned Chaos, American-Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises wrote that the term useful innocence was used by communists for those whom von Mises describes as confused and misguided sympathizers of the revolutionary idea. And just to wrap this up, using religion as a basis for decision making can result in some actions that the majority of people would call morally reprehensible. Modern historians generally agree that around 1.7 million people died as the results of the Crusades, which spanned from 1095 to 1291. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, was significantly influenced by religious tensions, particularly the conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism. This resulted in the estimated 200,000 deaths, making it one of the bloodiest conflicts in British Isles history. And the number of deaths resulting from the Middle East conflicts continues to soar. And it can be argued that these lives would not have been lost if the notion of a law-giving God did not exist. However, these macro-level events do not diminish the micro-level actions that stem from religious beliefs. Religious groups and people of faith actively provide emergency relief, including the recent pandemic response and assistance to homeless peoples and refugees, charitable giving, social services, particularly for the elderly, prisoners, vulnerable children, families in need, and the and underemployed, and medical care. Some of these contributions, such as those that people of faith and religious organizations provide to foster care, are possibly the most important private contributions to that particular service. People of faith tend to be more generous in charitable giving, and they have made foundational contributions to healthcare in the United States, contributions that continue today. This is not to mention disaster response, aid to refugees, prisoners assistance, and many other contributions. People of faith, motivated by the altruism they learn in their congregations and the encouragement they receive from the teachings of their faith, can easily join to magnify their efforts in caring for others. An individual who could do little alone to respond to the plight of prisoners or refugees, when combining their efforts with many others, can make an enormous difference. Even the prominent atheist Richard Dawkins saw the benefits of religious belief. He stated, "The social institution that is religion often fulfills the societal role of helping a community deal with tragedies and even individual families deal with personal tragedies which are not of broad scope, such as a death in the family or a house burning down. Religions fulfill several social roles which are necessary for a functioning society." Believing in a God who is a lawgiver and judge puts a constraint on the actions of individuals. All individuals act in their own rational self-interest. The atheistic nihilist is motivated by the concept of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow I may die. To the believer seeking eternal happiness in the afterlife, their motivation tends to be in the act of being of service to others. Kill God and you remove these benefits and destroy a moral compass that results in these benefits. This is the opportunity cost of atheism. Without a belief in God, other methods of dealing with moral questions must be used. This opens the door to situational ethics, a moral decision-making framework that emphasizes the importance of context when determining what is right and wrong. It suggests that moral judgment should be made based on the specific circumstances of a situation, rather than solely on adherence to fixed rules or principles. In other words, any action is justifiable. Economics is a descriptive, not a prescriptive science. It's not the job of an economist to decide right versus wrong, religious versus atheistic, which has a greater possibility of resulting in a net benefit to society. Deciding this is in the realm of philosophy. However, I will end with this. Oswald Spengler, in The Decline of the West, 1926, studied several cultures to confirm the patterns of nihilism were indeed a conspicuous feature of collapsing civilizations. In each of the failed cultures he examines, Spengler noticed that centuries-old religious, artistic, and political traditions were weakened and finally toppled by the insidious working of several distinct nihilistic postures. Well, I hope you found this podcast interesting and gives you something to think about. And I wrote a script for this one. And you can probably tell that I was reading a lot from the script. And most of my podcasts will be more ad lib and just offload some bullet points. But I just thought this was too important of a topic not to delve deeply into it. So hopefully you'll hang in there with my podcast, and some you'll enjoy, some you'll hopefully challenge you, and sometimes you'll challenge me. And if you can think of any method beyond religion where you could have absolute justifiable truth in judging the morality of actions, I would really enjoy hearing about them in the comment section. So, wishing you all a blessed day, and see you in the next podcast.